a recognised leader in talent management, on the topic of engagement in the age of digital transformation. Speaking today is Geoffroy De Lestrange, EMEA Product Marketing Manager at Cornerstone On Demand. Feel free to ask any questions at any point of the webinar. Geoffroy and myself will be monitoring them throughout, and he will answer them at the end. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me properly. If there is any issue with the sound, please type in the chat room. If you have any questions during the presentation, please also type it in the chat, and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of my presentation. So once again, thank you for joining. I'll be talking today about engagement in the age of digital transformation based on elements that we analyzed in a survey we did with the well-known analyst IDC. The reason why we did work with IDC on this European-wide survey is that we at Cornerstone really try to contribute to the thought process in the HR space, and it happens that it's extremely difficult to find any data at a European level. So you can usually find information at a global level, for example, with the famous Deloitte HCM survey happening every year. You can also find local analysis in the UK or some other European countries, but it's very difficult to be able to compare within Europe, which is the reason why we decided to take this initiative. One word on Cornerstone, if you don't know us, we are a software company, and we offer a talent management platform in the cloud. We've been created in 1999 and have been in Europe for more than 9 years now. We have 26 million users in our platform over across 2,700 companies and almost 200 countries. As you can see, the most recognized analysts on the market have considered us as leaders in their different comparisons. So that's why is this interesting for today, because what we want to share is also our own experience. So we're used to talking to HR directors, IT directors, to talk about digital transformation and how this impacts HR and how we manage people. So we really want to make the comparison between companies that already have thoughts about digital transformation, which is why they contact us, and the general market. What are the trends and how we can really understand the struggles and sometimes also misunderstandings within the organizations. What we did with this survey was that with IDC, we decided to reach half of the respondents HR managers and the other half line managers. This was interesting because usually you would find information from an HR point of view or from an IT director point of view or a sales director, whatever, you name it. But what we wanted to do here was to compare the vision on HR role and processes from the business and the HR point of view and see what were the differences and, of course, how we could reconcile the two of them. As I already mentioned, so we interrogated over 1,300 people on the phone in something like 16 European countries. And as IDC told me when we worked on it, this is probably the biggest HR survey in Europe, the most ambitious. So I'll start with the key takeaways, and then we'll be able to zoom in a little bit. The first one is that flexible working has a direct impact on employee engagement. To all those points I mentioned here, but I really want you to try and remember those takeaways. Those are the main findings from this survey. So yes, indeed, flexible working has a direct impact on employee engagement. The question that you would have to ask yourself is how you can implement a flexible working strategy and taking into account your own company culture, including the people that have predefined working space and time. So it can't be a home office for everyone. It's not always possible, but still you can inject some forms of flexible working for everyone. The second finding is that this idea of flexible working is increasing everywhere in Europe, but there are significant differences in the different countries. The other question we asked ourselves was about evaluating people and performance management. And no, performance management, performance reviews are not dead. You may have read quite a lot about this during the last year and a half, but it's definitely changing, and that's what we're going to talk about. A very interesting finding from this survey, one of the most surprising with the impact it had, is that collaboration is directly linked to financial performance. So the more you promote active collaboration in your organization, the higher you'll have, the highest will be the impact on your company performance. And the last point is a bit more generic from an HR point of view, is that HR has to sell itself better to its internal customers and line managers. So what we saw, and I'll get back to it, is that obviously line managers had some very short-term demands which HR had to answer, but HR also has a long-term role to fulfill, which is not always very well perceived by the line managers. So it would be important to work on this. I'll get back into more details on that. But what's the reason? Why is all this happening? Well, what we've seen is that there are two realities. The first one is that digital transformation is today, and you know this probably as good as I do, and probably even better, very high on the agenda of a CEO. We've seen how digital companies, pure players like Uber or Amazon or Google, have completely changed and disrupted entire industries. I could also mention Airbnb. And today, the management team of many organizations are asking themselves how they can ensure that their business will still be there in 5 or 10 years. So what we observe in the market as software providers is that very often HR people come to us because there is a company-wide strategy for which there is a sub-part addressing HR, which is the reason why companies come and talk to us. The other reason is that HR is late compared to other departments when it comes to digitalization. I am a marketing professional, and marketing has already been heavily modified and disrupted by digitalization. We've seen the arrival of new CRMs 10 years ago, and Salesforce, of course, is the best example. We've seen the arrival of marketing automation 5 years ago. We've seen the arrival of advanced analytics and big data 2 or 3 years ago. And everything now is happening to HR, but it goes much faster because the technology is already there in all the departments. The second reality is even more obvious, is that the world is changing, the world of work, but also the gray zone between work and private life. We all have smartphones, we all use Amazon at home, we all use Google at home and at work. So employees expect to have the same sort of tools at work? Why is Amazon or why is Google easier to use than any tool, software tool that they have at work? This is not logical. There is a need for more flexibility, and this goes across generations. Of course, the younger generations might be faster, but there is a sort of joint influence that goes through all the different age groups and categories. This is also the concept of what we call consumerization, where basically, as I mentioned before, you want to have the same ease of use at work than at home, and an increased transparency, which of course started with the development of social networks in the private life, but which also now is happening in the working life, for example, with Glassdoor. So employees expect now more trust and more respect from their employers. This is something that we could observe in the survey. So we tried to measure, to give a definition to happiness. Of course, it's just one definition, and you may find a different one, but we had to find something that we could measure. This definition we found is that happiness in this survey was defined as the people who were both proud to work for their companies and willing to recommend it. Recommendation is a very strong criteria. The reason being that if I recommend someone, I sort of commit myself twice, because I commit myself towards my friend whom I'm recommending, telling him or her that he or she would be happy to work in that company, and I also commit myself towards my employer, telling them that this person would be a perfect hire. So this is a very strong recruitment method, and actually one of the most efficient. Within Cornerstone, we hire between 1/3 and 4/10 of our employees via recommendations. So it's a very powerful one. So on average in Europe and in the UK, the percentage of people being happy at work, according to this definition, was 71%. Now, the question we can ask ourselves is this high or not? 3 people out of 10 that are not entirely happy at work, given that the respondents were not just employees. If you remember, the respondents of this survey were HR managers and line managers with team responsibility. So I don't know, it's really something that you can think about. Is a total of 3 managers out of 10 in HR and in the business being unhappy, high or not? I personally consider it rather high. But the good news is that you can do something about that. What we found out in the survey is that there was a link, a correlation between happiness and, in a broad sense, flexibility, which is a good news. And the very first one, I'll get back to it because it's very important, is internal mobility. The more you enable mobility, the happier your employees, and in that case, your managers. But also, and that's what you see on the rest of the page, the more tools you provide and the more flexibility you give in the way people organize their own work, the happier they are. And as I said before, it's not always possible to enable 100% flexibility for everyone, but it can start with very small things. I'll give a very precise example. In my former job, if I wanted to stay at home because I had a sick child, I had to take a day off. Today, working for Cornerstone, I don't have to. Obviously, I have a laptop, I can work from home, and I just tell my manager that I might be off to see a doctor with my child at some point in the afternoon, and that's it. No need to take a day off, and my work is done, and everybody's happy. It's a simple thing. It doesn't cost anything to the company, but it makes a huge psychological difference. So that's one example, of course, but it means that even the smallest action that you take to enable that kind of flexibility has a huge impact. Why? Because there's a key word behind that. The key word is trust. If I am entitled to work from home from time to time or to have some form of flexibility, it means that the company trusts me to do my job. And that's a very strong signal that you can send to your team members. So what does this mean from an HR point of view in terms of working methods? Well, that's probably the second most important slide you see here on the screen. It's not the nicest, but it's quite clear. You need, and I'm quoting David Wilson from Foster Group, HR needs to move from being process-driven to being business impact-driven. So you need to move from being focusing on process and automation to really impacting the business. This doesn't mean that you stop managing processes, of course not. But it means that when you organize your own time and what you want to manage yourself or outsource or give to other people, you really need to think first in terms of business impact. That's an important one. I'll get back to it. How do you do that? Well, there's another keyword for today, and that's agility. Of course, this might seem logical, but what I mean by that from a practical point of view is that if you want to do something new, if you want to renew a system to have processes that run seamless so that you can really spend more time with the business, you can't start a 3-year project because 3 years is too long. If you want to change an HRIS system, for example, you need to chunk it and according to the impact you want it to have on the business. Just to give one example, if you have a payroll system which is very old but which works, do you really need to change it? Will it really have an impact on your day-to-day business? Whereas if you see that, and I'll talk about learning in a moment, but if you see that there is a demand from the business because some competencies are lacking, then you need to spend more time talking to the business to really understand what they need now and what they will need in the future. Therefore, the impact we'll have on the business will be much higher. So that's one example. And it's not a question of company size. I think that's another good news that we observe on the market all over Europe. Of course, a few years ago, the most ambitious projects were driven by rather big corporations, big listed companies. And it might still be the case today. Yet what we see now is that there are more and more mid-market companies that have more agility, more flexibility in their own organization, and they move so fast that they actually become better in managing their talent in a new, more modern way. So it's not just a question of size, it's really a question of commitment and focus. Why is this important? Because there is a certain difference in the way HR and line managers perceive their role in the business. What you see here is a list of actions that HR may or may not do to support the business. Those are elements from the survey, obviously, and I've put in red the figures for the UK. The point here, which is point number 1, is how important management skills are in the company. Of course, it's rated a bit higher in HR than for line managers. For the first three, the figures for the UK were roughly the same. But still, it's very, very important to enable line managers in their role as HR players, because they are actually the most important HR players in the company. I remember an article from the CIPD which was listing all the qualities that we would need to expect from a line manager, and it was so huge, so long, that basically it was impossible. A line manager was almost a Superman, and they can't be, but they need HR support. They need to be trained to be good coaches, to know how to recruit, to know how to train, to know how to evaluate, and so on and so forth. I'd like to focus on the bottom two topics here, where there is a bit of an issue. The first word is frustration. So we see that 4 line managers out of 10 in Europe and in the UK are frustrated by HR processes. So one element here is the importance of, I would say, lean HR. The second one is the fact that half of the line managers in Europe, a bit less in the UK, which is good, are not entirely happy in the way HR supports them with tools to recruit, reward, and retain talent, which is what they need on a daily basis. So, as you can see here, there is definitely room for improvements in the way the business understands what HR is doing for them. But whether we talk about HR or line managers, actually, at the end of the day, the most important stakeholders here are the employees themselves, of course. They become the true priority, and that's another positive aspect of technology, is that you can now include more people in your talent strategy. Why? Because a few years ago, if you wanted to, say, evaluate or train people across the entire organization, it would have been extremely expensive. Today, with a combination of cloud technology and mobile technology, this becomes much cheaper. If you have, for example, if you are a distribution company with shops all over the country, you can have one single tablet in a shop to help train your employees, and they will each log in with their own username and password, so they can access whatever you want to train them on at their different lunchtime or breakouts, whatever. This was not possible 5 years ago. You would have had to buy a laptop, which was much more expensive. And that's important because there are many areas where we see a lack of talent. Sometimes you can even hear about a war for talent. And this can be solved when you access your entire pool of talent within the organization. People might be working in a non-qualified position, but that doesn't mean that they are non-qualified themselves or that they cannot be developed and be promoted. And this is a real-life example that I've seen in a logistics company, client of Cornerstone, where they had trouble hiring people outside of the organization, and they used this technology to have a better vision of the people who were working for them in their warehouses. And that's how they managed to find their future team leaders. So that's a great example here. The quote you may remember is the one from the famous analyst George Person, who said that you need to treat your employees as customers and consumers. I've talked about this concept of consumerization already, which means that really you want your employees because it has an impact on referral and on recruitment. It has an impact on absenteeism. There was a study, I think, in the UK that mentioned 60% less missing days and an increased loyalty, so a higher retention rate. So this has a direct impact. I mentioned this figure from the survey showing how important mobility was, and that's a direct link to what we said about putting employees at the center. Mobility is not linear anymore, so of course you may still hire someone as a junior, and that person becomes a senior manager and then maybe a team manager and so on. But today we speak about lattice mobility, people who may move from one department to another without specifically being promoted, but they want to do something different. And this is a recruitment criteria from the point of view of candidates. There was a recent survey in the UK showing that this question of mobility was one of the most important questions for the candidates. Therefore, that's probably one of the most important roles of HR, is to reconciliate the company needs and the employee wishes. In addition, we've seen that there is a sort of blur between internal and external recruiting. Why? Because, as I said, you need to treat your own internal employees just like external candidates. One simple test is, well, what I would call the LinkedIn test. 2 questions. Today, if you want to have the latest information on an employee CV, where do you look? In your own systems or on LinkedIn? I think you know the answer. And the second question is maybe a sort of homework that you can do after the webinar. Try and remember someone who left your company on his or her own accord, say 1 or 2 years ago. Try and remember one name of someone who left. And then have a look at that person's LinkedIn profile and try to think, did you know that that person was able to do everything that he or she has been doing since he or she left your company? That's very often a cruel question to ask, because we know that people leave a company because they are not satisfied with their managers and they feel they don't have enough potential within the organization, and they found the potential elsewhere. But maybe you are losing very good candidates internally. At the end of the day, I've mentioned it a few times, HR has to be very close to the business. And as a proof point, we at Cornerstone see more and more senior HR profiles within client companies that actually do not have an HR background, but they come directly from the business. So it's both a good and maybe a bad sign. The bad sign might be that the C-level in those companies consider that they need to find someone outside of the HR department to fill in a strategic HR position. The good sign is that it shows how strategic HR is being perceived now. So how can you be perceived in a better way? How can you improve the way people see what you do? In this survey, we clearly saw that there was a need or a demand for quite short-term HR efficiency from a line manager point of view. And that's important because it's also a quick win for you. If we see what's here on the screen, speed to hire and time to competency basically means in both cases that the line manager has a need for a specific skill that is not in the team, and either he wants or she wants you to find someone or to train someone, but at the end of the day, the skill needs to be there. And the point is that you know how to hire and you know how to train. So that's why I'm saying it's a quick win. And if you manage to fill in those needs quickly and efficiently, then you will have a very good entry point to talk about longer-term issues, which is what you would like to talk about and what you need from line managers. You need their input to be able to plan for the longer-term workforce. What's important here is also the underlying idea of measuring the impact of what to do. I'll talk later about measuring HR efficiency, but in any case, being closer to the business implies that you have a more data-driven approach to increase the value and the relevance of what you do. You would need to give it some thoughts on how you would define your own metrics, because the metrics you define should match the business strategy, and you also need to leverage the power of the most modern technology here on predictive analytics and data visualization, which are still quite new and have a huge power to help you make decisions and explain your own decisions to line managers and to the management of the company. Why is this important? It's also another data from the survey. I didn't put here the UK figures because they were quite close to the European ones, but we see that there is a need for HR and business alignment. And basically, the very first one is interesting, faster HR procedures, because basically line managers do not want to be bothered with processes. They want things to work. But the other interesting point on that graph is actually that no figure stands out. And I was a bit surprised when I found those results in the survey. There is no clear element that is way above the others. There are 6 or 7 elements here which are more or less around 30% of respondents. And if we try to sum up everything, basically it goes back to a few key points. Line managers need your support as they are your main. You need to work with them on their competency needs in the short term and in the long term. And you need to manage career in a personalized and targeted way. Still quoting Josh Bersin. And the last one, which I found interesting, is how high in this graph was workforce modeling, because that's quite a long-term issue, and that would be also a good way to engage in strategic discussions with the management team. So this was so far rather generic, but we may want to zoom in different tasks that you have in HR. And what I would like to share now is not just how we react to those data, but how we see the market evolving. I talked about moving from being process-driven to being business-driven, and you can really apply this to those 4 topics that you see on the screen, which are your daily bread, I would say. In recruiting, we really moved from what used to be called applicant tracking system to candidate relationship management. In performance, we used to have those boring performance reviews. And today, we talk more and more about real-time feedback. In the past, learning was mostly, or at least first, towards being compliant. And today, we talk more about self-directed learning and collaboration. Analytics used to be purely historical, and today we talk about predictive analytics. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, it doesn't mean that you stop being applicant-focused, that you stop doing any annual discussions, that you stop managing compliance and so on. But it does mean that you need to be both of them the left side of the screen and the right side of the screen. The two of them are now equally important. If we go through those 4 different topics, in recruiting, as I said, you still need to manage the basics, the recruiting process, the candidate search, the tracking process, the interview process, and so on. Of course, that's normal. However, you also need to embrace the recent evolutions in HR, such as social sourcing, mobile recruiting, employee recommendation, I've talked about it already, video interviews, and so on. Those are all very important aspects because I've seen that very recently. You need to enable instant application where people do not need to fill in lengthy questionnaires. They can directly apply with their LinkedIn profile and maybe film themselves instead of sending an application letter. Those are examples of what's happening today. And this is important because the survey also showed that recruitment was the clear priority in the UK and in Europe. Recruitment here is clearly the #1 topic all over Europe, which is why I think that you really should think about using more modern tools for that. This also includes mobility, I've mentioned it before, and succession planning. The second aspect here on that graph, on the priority, is training. And as I said before, actually it's not a surprise because whether in recruiting or in training, you're trying to fill in missing skills. So it's logical that the two of them are very high on the list of priorities. And just like recruiting, learning has changed dramatically. I can see today my own kids search for information on YouTube or on Wikipedia by themselves. Sometimes they get back and teach me things that I didn't know on some topics because they were curious and they were just surfing around. And all those new ways of learning now actually demand new skills within the HR department. If we talk about social learning or mobile learning, if we talk about targeted content, if we talk about user-generated content or knowledge sharing, you need new skills. That's clear. Typically, a knowledge community may mean that you would need to hire a community manager who usually would sit in marketing. But now we're talking about HR. We're not talking about marketing. If we talk about user-generated content, it also means that you need to know who are the users who could generate interesting content, which makes the direct link to performance management. And I'll talk about that just later. What's interesting in this survey, and I've mentioned it at the very beginning, is that there is a very clear link between collaboration and growth. As you can see here, high growth organizations are much more represented in the companies that actively push collaboration. And I insist on the word actively push. See the first 2 points here on the graph. The first one, employees are encouraged to work together. And the second one, there is a system to aid collaborative learning. And the third one, employees are encouraged to share knowledge. So those 3 elements mean that there is a clear element in the company culture to share knowledge, to collaborate. And this is heavily represented within high growth company. That's a very interesting point here because, once again, it's not so much a question of money or investment. It's a question of company culture, of promoting a culture of collaboration and trust. I've talked about the link with performance. Of course, you've read a lot probably during the last 2 years about the so-called death of performance appraisal, but it's far from being the case. What we've seen in the survey is that both HR and line manager still consider that performance reviews are useful. But the important point here is that it's changing. We've talked about social recruiting, we've talked about social learning. There's also a question of social evaluation and recognition. It's not just about giving marks out of 5, is that person good, very good, not very good, whatever. It's really about understanding a certain person's skills and potential to see how he or she could get better on a daily basis, and also what kind of potential that person would have in the middle or long term. So the consequence is that performance review is evolving, and the good news for you is that it seems to be a bit better in the UK than in the other European countries. What we see, the very first element is that the topic is changing. Instead of one yearly performance review where you would talk about everything, there are different conversations going on. One obviously on performance, but one on development, and one on compensation. And it's logical, because those are different topics that might even involve different people. Talking about someone's performance, you need to get the line manager, of course, but you also need to have information from the direct colleagues, from the people who beneficiate from that person's work. When we talk about employee development and training, you need to understand what needs to get better in the short term so that the employee does a better job, and what are his or her wishes for the future to train that person to maybe take a new position in 1 or 2 years' time. And compensation still remains mostly yearly, which is kind of normal. So you want to have a discussion on compensation and taking into account that person's performance and also that person's potential if he or she is changing job within the organization. At the end of the day, you also need to be able to measure what you do, whether we talk about learning, recruiting, performance, succession planning, and so on. You need to use the power of analytics. And this is also an area which has seen many developments over the last 2-3 years. There is a definition of HR analytics, which I'm taking from Josh Bersin. There are 2 dimensions: historical data versus predictive data, and process data versus organization-wide data. So you start with process data from a historical point of view, and that's what we call reporting. That's all the standard reports that you do when you want to see the success of a specific activities that you've organized. You want to measure the efficiency of your campus recruiting campaign, or you want to see if a specific compliance training has been successful. But then you can do this across the organization, and that's very important because it's business intelligence. That's where you will be able to identify some underlying trends within your own organization and have a very visual understanding of what's happening. And this is where you would get the consolidated data to talk with your own management team. But then you can also use predictive analytics to understand potential. That's where you really talk about potential risk, if we talk about compliance risk, or what I would say a positive potential when we talk about succession planning. And if you expand this across the entire organization, that's where we talk about workforce planning. Workforce planning is also using some form of prediction to anticipate future needs at an organization-wide level. I'll zoom in a little bit on the third one, predictive analytics, which is probably the less well-known today, with a few examples. So what would be predictive analytics at a process level? Well, you see some examples here. How can I predict who will stay longer, or who is the best candidate within the organization to take on a new position? What are the factors that can predict performance, and so on and so forth. So I'll just give a few examples on training, where you would ask what are the courses that can have the highest impact on someone's performance based on a mix of historical and predictive data. You can take historical data when you zoom in on a specific person, and you can also use predictive data to see what will have the highest impact. Another example here would be career pathing, which is useful both for internal mobility and external recruitment. If I am applying at a junior position, is it just a straight road, as I said before, from being senior to junior to senior to manager, or are there other career paths possible that would be interesting for me, depending on my skills and my wishes? Another example would be planning. I've mentioned it before. So analytics is definitely a very, very, very important topic for HR today. Last but not least, before I jump to the conclusion, I want to have one word on IT architecture for HR. This is important because we see very often that the most successful projects are when IT and HR have a perfect understanding of one another's vision and constraints and wishes, which the projects which might be a bit more difficult are when IT doesn't really understand what HR needs and want to enforce a rather traditional vision of HR architecture. We believe that we need to move from what used to be the old days, where you had very often on-premise, but can be on the cloud, doesn't make any difference here, a traditional HRIS system, really focusing on managing process and admin, where nowadays you would really have a talent-centric architecture linked with back-office systems such as payroll or HRIS or benefits or time and attendance. Why? Because, as you've seen over the last few slides, it is with talent management that you will have the strongest impact on the business, that you will be able to measure this impact and to have strategic conversations with your line managers and the management of the company. My personal opinion, you may not agree with me, but my personal opinion is that HR should not be a business partner. And I don't like this expression of HR business partner. Why? Because HR is much more than a partner. A supplier can be a partner. A client can also be considered a partner. But HR is in the business. HR is not just a partner. HR is what makes the business. The people make the business. In conclusion of this whole presentation, I think there are 5 drivers or keywords impact HR. The first one is mobility. I've talked a lot about that one, but it's really, really, really important. Internal mobility helps you create a pool of potential leaders. It has a direct impact on employee motivation and henceforth on recommendation. It is a very, very strong message to your own employees and to the outside world that you trust your own people. The second one is the company culture. Company culture, for me, is among the highest responsibilities in HR. Of course, the culture may come from the top, really from the management of the company. But if you need to make your culture evolve, or if you need to ensure that new hires will fit into the company culture, you need HR expertise. And that's very important to work on company culture. The third one, once again, I'm repeating myself, but that's the conclusion, business impact. You can use today very advanced analytics and data and planning technology to foster a constructive dialogue with line managers, because as you've seen with this IDC survey, line managers are eager to get more support from HR. So there is a huge potential for you to create a new conversation with line managers, which implies a culture of innovation, and that's what we would call connect. That's really collaboration. You've seen how impactful collaboration was on the results of a company. So that's really something where you can, once again, have a direct impact on the business. And the last one, and the most important word maybe of the whole presentation, that's engagement. Engagement is both the end result of what you do and also the new start of the whole process. That's how you start a virtuous circle of trust and motivation. Thank you very much. So that was my presentation on employee engagement in the age of digital transformation. We have a few minutes for questions, so if you could type them in the chat. I hope I should be able to see them. So I don't see any questions, but I don't know if I have the right to see the questions. I'm talking to the HR Grapevine team.
Okay.
If you can see the questions.
Hello, Geoffroy. Yeah, we do have a question, actually. This one's from...
oh, I don't see them at all, so maybe you could read them to me.
No worries. This was two, actually, from Andrew Gibson. He'd like to know, will the slides be distributed after this presentation? And also, which single innovation do you feel will make the biggest impact for businesses?
Well, the first one, yes, of course, we can send the presentation. And by the way, the survey is also available. There is the entire version of the survey covering all the European data, which is 68 pages. And there is a UK-specific version of the survey, which only has 14 pages. So you choose which one you prefer. On innovation, that's a very good question. It's a bit difficult to say. For me, the point is that all the innovations that we've seen over the last, say, 5 to 10 years are logical consequences of the innovations before. So it all started basically with cloud computing. It's because you have cloud computing that you can have easy accessible tools. It's because you have easy accessible tools that you can have a nicer look and feel. And then it's because it's on the cloud that you can have a mobile app and that you can develop social tools, and then it's because you have all this that you have more and more users. So that means you have more and more data, and you can have advanced analytics and so on and so forth. But if I had to choose, I would name two which have heavily modified our private life, but not yet entirely the working life, and that's mobile and social. As I said, we all have smartphones, and we all use them heavily at home and at work, but it hasn't, the way it has impacted our working life is not finished. I think there is still even more potential for our working life to change because of mobile technology. And one of the elements is what I mentioned before, is the fact that it can really address everyone. I'll just take one very precise example here. One of our customers is the French Post. It's not seen as the most modern and digitalized company, yet when they decided to think about a digital learning project, they did a very quick survey internally on who was or wasn't using a smartphone, and they saw that a huge majority of employees distributing posts physically, the post people, had smartphones. So that would make their own life much easier to train them on new methods and new technologies. So basically they were afraid that people would be reluctant to use mobile learning, where actually the post people were much more advanced than what they thought. So that's one example where certainly using mobile impacts a company that has more than 100,000 employees. So that's one example.
Cool.
Social, yeah?
Andrew has replied. He said, you mentioned non-traditional HR employees. I think this will breed innovation and increase engagement in HR to the rest of the business. Do you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And as I said, I think the main difference between HR and line managers that we saw on the survey was really the fact that line managers had very short-term needs to be fulfilled, to be efficient, and HR actually prefers to talk about longer-term issues such as workforce planning and succession management. But the two are important, and I think being very efficient on short-term demands will help HR engaging longer-term conversations on strategy with the management of the company and the line managers on a daily basis.
We have another question, this time from Daniela, who says, what is the impact of flexible working on performance, and is there data for this, e.g. working from home increases efficiency?
Yeah, so in this survey, and you'll be able to read it in the long version of the survey, we saw a direct relationship between flexibility and what we named happiness. Flexibility also includes this idea of collaboration, sharing knowledge, sharing ideas, which is easier, of course, if you have a more flexible way of working, and that itself has a direct influence on a company results. In addition, maybe a bit of a teaser here, the survey we did this year, 2016, with IDC, was focusing on employee engagement, but we intend to work on a new survey with IDC probably next year, where we will tackle a bit more in detail the topic of efficiency. So stay tuned for more, maybe in a few months' time. Hopefully in spring, we should be able to provide with new data and new insights on this topic.
Cool. And one final question, this time from Matt Arnold. asks, is there going to be an update to the Cornerstone app in the future, looking at usability and experience?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understand what you mean with update. Because the point, and that's if you talk about technology, I can take Cornerstone as an example because we're a software provider. We, when you have a cloud-based solution, we keep updating our solution. We have 4 updates a year, so it's really a process of continuous innovation. It's not an update as we used to have, or today, you have on your smartphone, you have iOS 9 and you'll have iOS 10. That's an update. But when we talk about cloud-based technology, it's not so much an update as a continuous innovation. So when we talk about, if I take this example of predictive analytics, just to take that one, what we do is that we provide analytics dashboards to HR, and we keep adding new dashboards. So that's the process of continuous innovation. It's not just an update. But I hope this is what you meant. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's all the questions, Geoffroy. So yeah, thank you, Geoffroy.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone who attended today as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Also, just a reminder that this webinar will be uploaded to HR Grapevine's YouTube channel soon. So, goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.